À-bas-le-ciel.
Now, ask yourself really did keep his cool. He did an excellent job throughout the whole conversation. I can't find any fault with him, frankly. The audience really got restless, and the audience got offended. You know, they were really challenged by this in a way they weren't expecting to be challenged in this conversation. If there's a disaster, some people are running away from the disaster, and some people are running toward it. Now, why are they running toward it? Yes, in part, it is simply because they believe they can make a positive difference. They believe they can try. I don't want to be one of the people running away. But of course, this is only in small part due to the possibility that I can make a positive difference. With many of these problems, the enormity of them is so great that anyone can say as an objective fact, maybe I can't make any positive difference, or the positive difference I can make is very, very small. Whether we're talking about vegan politics, First Nations, what have you. The most fundamental value I have shaping this whole direction, this whole side of my character that links me to both research and humanitarian work and issues as diverse as Cambodia and the Cree and Ojibwe in Canada. The most fundamental value I have under this heading is of wanting to take responsibility, even if I can't. There's no way that I or you or anyone can take responsibility for the history of the British Empire and the terrible decisions they made in how they've handled Canada's Indigenous people, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dene, the Mohawk, the Iroquois. Okay. It's actually impossible for me to take responsibility for that. But I want to. It's impossible for me to take responsibility in any sense for the daily atrocity, the unbelievable moral obscenity of factory farming. We've had this cultural development over hundreds of years that led up to the current stainless steel perfection of the meat and dairy industry, right? There's no way I can take responsibility for it. But I want to. And I want you to as well. I want you to try.
À-bas-le-ciel. À-bas-le-ciel.
Politics gets interesting. Politics gets really, really interesting when we're no longer talking about differences of opinion. We're no longer talking about contrasting factual claims, but we're talking about differences in values. I just had a wonderful conversation with a guy named Ask Yourself that lasted many, many hours. The name of his YouTube channel is Ask Yourself. His name is Isaac Brown. And he's now a full-time YouTuber supported by his YouTube revenue and by donations on Patreon. Now, at the first mention of this, some of my longtime viewers and supporters will be asking, did we talk about racism? And we did at great length and without either party becoming uncouth or hostile. We had a very polite, meaningful, and enjoyable discussion about racism, including the racism of some of my fellow YouTubers, Corey McCarthy and Tara McCarthy. And that's going to get mentioned here really as kind of a segue to what I want to talk about in this video. It's not the main theme or not the main point of interest that I'm here bringing up in summarizing what we did discuss. I also want to put in a disclaimer for most of this part of the conversation. Isaac, aka Ask Yourself, Isaac was really playing devil's advocate or playing sort of traditional role in Socratic method, Socratic dialogue. In large part, he was not stating his own convictions. He was stating views that were opposing to mine in such a way that would draw out implicit assumptions, cause me to more fully define what my position is and why that's my position, or what actions or consequences my policy positions might entail. So again, totally polite and frankly fascinating conversation. One of the best conversations I've had in years, and I reach out to a lot of people here through Vegan YouTube. So I really give him credit for that, and I thanked him extensively at the end of the conversation. However, what I don't want you to do in the audience watching this video, I don't want you to try to impute any opinion to Isaac on the basis of what I'm saying here. Basically, I'm just summarizing what I said, and a large part of what he said, even if it is getting summarized or mentioned here, it was really just him playing devil's advocate and playing this Socratic dialogue sort of role. So don't jump to any conclusions about what his own political views are on these or any matters from this particular video. And by the way, if you think this video was too long, the actual conversation I had with Ask Yourself went on for hours and hours, included an amazing range of topics, including our views on the ever-popular unnatural vegan, who he just proposed he was going to have a debate with, my experience with the natural vegan. And for him, the conversation probably started around 2 a.m. and ended closer to 8 a.m. It wasn't just me, it was a whole room of people, but for several hours, it was him and I talking directly and continuously. By the way, I was actually working out. I was outdoors. I was running up and down the side of a mountain here with stairs on the side. I was getting exercise, so I was often out of breath when I was answering his questions. But it was a great conversation. It made my day, quite simply. All right, so the part of the conversation I'm going to summarize did indeed begin with my challenging him and him challenging me on the question of to what extent his friends, because he is personally friends with Corey McCarthy and he's spoken at some length with Tara McCarthy. So to what extent his friends, Corey McCarthy and Tara McCarthy, are pro-genocide or indeed racist in the garden variety sense of the term racism. Now, I introduced, some kind of facts for his consideration. This is not just a matter of opinion. Examples of things they've said on YouTube that he was unaware of. So again, before we get to the discussion about values, sort of this earlier phase where we're dealing with merely matters of fact and opinion within the realm of political theory or political science. I just mentioned, I think one of the deeper differences between myself and Isaac is that he really does think of matters in terms of abstract ideals first and foremost, and I think of things in terms of abstract ideals last and least. And this may not be obvious if we're talking about something we agree about, like veganism or the future of the vegan movement or something, or even what positive things can we do in the next couple of months for the future of the vegan movement, because we did talk about that kind of stuff, brass tacks, practical stuff. He was talking about putting together a vegan roundtable, and we talked through some of the issues and options concerning that. But to give a specific example, when the conversation progressed from overall questions of racism, maybe primarily white versus black racism, when it progressed onto racism against First Nations, status of Indigenous people in Canada, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dene, he asked me repeatedly, maybe 2 or 3 times, what was the ideal situation I wanted? So, what was the final endpoint or outcome? What was the goal? Or you might say, what was the utopia? He did not use a word like utopia. But he said, okay, well, what is it you want? What is the position you're tending towards as an outcome? And he did use words like ideal. What is it ideally you'd want? And I never answered that question. I mean, if you're looking at this from a political science perspective, you notice I didn't ever answer that question by talking about the ideals I was in pursuit of. I would answer by giving a particular example of a real-world problem that I wanted to solve. And, you could criticize me by saying my perspective on these issues is just one of crisis management, is just one of pragmatic, short-term, particular changes I want to make, and not one of an idealistic objective or utopian goal or what have you. Maybe that's a criticism that has some teeth, has some pertinence, or has some salience looking at my views. But I think on a deeper level, it shows a real difference between my way of thinking and his. And of course, I am much older than him with much different experiences in life, although we both started off in Southern Ontario, Canada. So who knows, maybe as the years go past, maybe he'll come a little bit further over to my side. Again, I don't really mean about any issue, but in the procedural way he thinks about some of these political issues. Concision is in large part the art of omission. So I'm not summarizing the whole conversation here, and I probably could. I probably could go through it blow by blow, because we just had this conversation within the last couple of hours, and I am cursed with a good memory. It is a curse sometimes. You can be haunted by overly accurate memories in this life. I think it drives some people mad. But at any rate, again, don't assign any of this to him. He probably would have a different summary from his perspective. But jumping ahead several stages in the conversation, there was a really interesting turning point. And before we got to this turning point, already I was really framing the whole conversation in a way that put Indigenous people's issues first and foremost. That's just partly because that's sincerely what I care about. I wasn't going to engage in this conversation about race and racism within the North American context, United States and Canada, as if black and white are the only issues. The issues that matter to me a lot are the Cree and the Dene and the Ojibwe and the Inuit, etc., etc. And also for me, in large part, it's about language and culture, not about race and ethnicity. So these are values I bring into the conversation to some extent, steer the way the conversation went. There was a turning point when I mentioned a video that he had never seen, a video in which Tara McCarthy had a map of the United States of America behind her in the video, a color-coded map. She managed to get a map from U.S. Census data that showed the United States broken up into a bunch of very small squares, and it showed where black people lived and where there were the fewest black people, where there was an absolute white majority, etc. So what percentage of the different districts and boroughs of the United States is black? And in this video, Tara was explaining her reasons and what have you for why she and her husband, they wanted to live in an area with the fewest possible black people. That was her position. Now, I mentioned this. I was raising this, of course. My overall point here was either we're willing to call these people racist, i.e. racist in their policy positions, racist in their motives, what have you, or I think we are getting into a semantic argument where racism is being defined so narrowly that it becomes meaningless or indeed laughable. You might think that in this conversation we were already talking about personal values. In a sense we were, but not in the sense I mean here and now. This is really the turning point in the conversation, where it went from really being matters of fact and matters of opinion being shared by the two sides to matters of personal values, where this is no longer a debate, this is no longer an exchange of objective, factual information, I certainly was not trying to convince the other side of anything. We're no longer talking about things. We're talking about who we are and who we aspire to be, why we are the way we are, why we think the way we think, why we feel the way we feel, why we have in the past undertaken the actions and decisions we did, and in the future, why we're likely to make those same choices. That's when we cross this bridge into real questions of personal values. Isaac challenged me on this point, the point of why Tara was sitting there with this color-coded map of the United States talking about her color-coded perspective of where she was going to live, that she was planning to avoid living around African Americans. He challenged me in the following way. He said, is it or is it not possible for a person to make that decision without any racist inclination or any racist motivation? He asked, is it or is it not natural, necessary, inevitable that people would choose a neighborhood with a lower crime rate, that they would choose a neighborhood with better schools, that they would choose a neighborhood where they could have an easy and comfortable life? And right off the bat, I responded to him, I completely understand the point you're making, Isaac, but this is where we profoundly differ on the level of personal values. And now we're going to switch into talking about that. So I was, even during the conversation, I was really aware of this shift, where now I'm just talking about who I am and why I am this way, and the differences between me and him. There's nothing to win and there's nothing to lose. Because I said to him, no, I profoundly disagree with you about this, although I can understand those motives. And I said to him, in a sense, Isaac, what you're doing is defending racism by indicating the extent to which racism can overlap with, so it can coincide with cowardice, laziness, and the desire to have a luxurious, easy life. And of course, in some cases, maybe people are not racist. Maybe it is purely those other motives, cowardice and a lack of interest in making the world a better place, solving social problems or engaging or even seeing social problems. Some people want to live in a gated community behind a high wall where they don't ever have to see poverty, let alone try to solve the problem, ameliorate the problem, or what have you. And I'm not one of those people. I said to him, he was using the example of, would I or would I not be willing to move to Compton? He said, I can do you one better. Why do you think I moved to Cambodia? What do you think? I mean, what's more dangerous? Really? I mean, I know Compton has a reputation, but come on, let's get real. You're talking about a scenario, which he did talk about, he did raise, what about providing my own daughter with an education? And I was able to use not abstract examples, but very real examples from my own life. I said, look, when I was dealing with First Nations, whether you're talking about urban neighborhoods that are majority First Nations, or if you're talking about reservations, remote rural communities, those have shockingly high unemployment rates, shockingly high crime rates, terrible education system, much, much worse than Compton. Believe me, I mean, Compton, it's a great ladder in terms of being able to move up in the social hierarchy compared to the baleful lack of opportunities that you'd find on some of the worst native reservations in Canada, or indeed just urban neighborhoods in Canada that are majority First Nations. Really, really terrible conditions, really hopeless conditions, and again with very high very high suicide rates, very high glue huffing rates, and so on, attached to that overall hopelessness that's set in. In some cases, you are looking at a district that literally has 90% unemployment. I've looked at some examples like that. So, I mean, the situation with First Nations, much more bleak and much more extreme than asking me, for example, if I would be willing to move to Compton or I'd be willing to raise my daughter in Compton. The specific scenarios I put myself in Cambodia and in northern Laos, again, much, much more extreme. And I laughed at one point. I said, don't you realize people in Compton speak English? Like, what do you think would be harder for me, moving to Compton or moving to the border area between Laos and Myanmar at a time when there's still ongoing civil war, low-level civil war, on both sides of that border? I don't speak the language. I'm struggling to learn the language. What do you think? And he was really shocked. And again, with this transition from just talking about politics to really talking about personal values, I really noticed a shift in how the audience was engaged too. They were really challenged by this in a way that they were not challenged at all by the conversation we were having previously. So he started asking questions like, well, he was sincerely interested in understanding my position, but he was asking me things like, well, would I be willing to go and live in Somalia? Why or why not? What was the explanation for why I as a person would prefer to live in a poverty-stricken Civil War area with terrible education than to live in luxury and comfort? And, for what reason do I regard people as cowards for wanting to avoid dealing with important social and political issues and even economic issues within their own society? Why do I regard people as cowards and immoral for retreating behind, the gated fence of a wealthy community, making what he sees as rational decisions that are in their own self-interest? And this is the point. This is the difference in values. I am not disputing whether or not those decisions are rational. They're rational, but their motives are based in a set of values that are different from mine. And it's a set of values that I consider despicable. Now, ask yourself, really did keep his cool. He did an excellent job throughout the whole conversation. I can't find any fault with him, frankly. The audience really got restless, and the audience got offended. They were really challenged by this in a way they weren't expecting to be challenged in this conversation. I think, for one thing, the same way people find it strangely out of place in the 21st century when I use words like dignity and honor, I don't think anyone was expecting to hear the word cowardice in this conversation. I don't think anyone had even ever thought before that the decision to live in a wealthy, whites-only neighborhood reflected cowardice, that the decision not to face up to poverty and violence and other serious problems, that this was connected to cowardice that cut people quick. And, another word I used was despicable. I said, look, I'm being honest with you. There's a difference between you and me. There's a difference between me and many other people. But yeah, the people on the other side of this difference in values, I do regard them as despicable. I understand they are people who just want a life of ease and comfort and luxury. To what extent that entails cowardice and to what extent that entails racism, given this conversation, is another matter. But yeah, I'm owning up to the fact I despise that. I used an example some of you already know from this YouTube channel. I said, look, it was even like this when I was talking to my own grandmother. To some extent, that grandma was only one of my two grandmothers. To some extent, I had some positive emotional attachment to her. She used to buy Lego for me every Christmas and every birthday. She gave me presents. She gave me socks. Whatever. She's my grandmother. But to me, in terms of her values, yeah, she was a despicable person. She wanted to pontificate about politics, so much so that she enrolled in classes on politics at the University of Toronto as an auditing student in her retirement, in her old age, over 65, just so she could go there and lecture them. She could tell a captive audience her opinions about politics. She went and played tennis at a golf club, once every couple of days. She could talk about these political issues. She was basically a bit of a cookie cutter left-winger, so these issues with the poor and miscellaneous political issues she took a stand on, but she wasn't willing to sacrifice her own comfort in even the smallest way imaginable. She wasn't willing to drive to Compton or do anything else. I mean, her life after her retirement was, from my perspective, a life of self-indulgence and hypocritical self-indulgence in terms of what her political values and convictions were, right? And very polite, I never insulted her on it, but sure, she and I had sat down and had meaningful conversations. Because at one point, it was like I was telling her, well, look, I've been living in Southeast Asia. I'm trying to do this kind of humanitarian work and this kind of research and so on. And now, next, this is where I'm moving and so on. I remember at one point, she asked me why I didn't just learn French and move to Quebec. Like, in that conversation, I really had to turn it around on her, and I really had to explain to her, look, if these are the principles you live by, it doesn't matter whether you decide to make a difference in Compton or in Laos or Cambodia or Haiti or Somalia. Another example I talked about with Ask Yourself. Different people are going to find different opportunities to make a difference in the world. And then there are people who just want an easy life, who just want a life that's safe and self-indulgent, cowardly. There are people who want to live in voluntary ignorance, and there are people who want to live like hypocrites from the safety of their condominiums, from the safety of their golf course and their tennis club, from their walled community. And yeah, I'm not just morally opposed to that. There's a real difference between myself and those people on the level of values that comes out in this conversation. Now, you can't really understand what's going on in this conversation if you think it's a debate, if you think I'm trying to present facts that will convince the other side to come over and share my opinion. I'm not. We're into this realm of personal values where I'm just disclosing, I'm just explaining to you, this is who I am, this is how I think, this is how I feel maybe in the past tense. This is how I ended up this way. This is why I turned out this way. And there's absolutely no expectation on my part that I'm going to convince Ask Yourself to feel the way I feel or think the way I think. I'm really just interested in exploring the difference between us and between the difference between myself and the other members of the audience or the public at large or even the culture I grew up in. Because I know I'm in a very small minority of people in Canada who feel this way. The response from the audience was much more hostile, much more defensive than anything Ask Yourself said. I can find no fault whatsoever in what Ask Yourself said. He behaved himself wonderfully. I mean, as I say, he really was playing this kind of Socratic role. Find no fault in him. And what I felt from the audience, several of the audience, they got on the microphone and they spoke. They spoke from their own perspective too. They were asking questions that amounted to wanting to know, how did I draw the line? Who was I to judge? And again, it's not really about me judging other people. It's really about what kind of person am I? What kind of person do I aspire to be? What kind of person are you? And what kind of person do you aspire to be? And I can express to you. I can explain to you. I can answer those questions. We can get into more detail and give a more complete, robust portrait of how I draw the line, of why exactly I think this way, or how my opinion applies to different kinds of desert island scenarios. But ultimately, all we're doing is drawing an ever more detailed portrait of me and my values. We're not putting together a case that's going to convince anyone else to come over to my side. We're just going to understand more and more. It's, to some extent, more and more psychological complexity, what those differences are, why they exist. If there's a disaster, some people are running away from the disaster, and some people are running toward it. Now, why are they running toward it? Yes, in part, it is simply because they believe they can make a positive difference. They believe they can try. Maybe they're going to try and end up making things 1,000 times worse. But some people are running away to safety, to their life of comfort, and some people are running toward the problem because they're sincerely interested in solving the problem, improving, ameliorating, dealing with, or at least researching and trying to understand the problem to make policy recommendations for other people to solve the problem or something of that kind, right? I don't want to be one of the people running away. But of course, this is only in small part due to the possibility that I can make a positive difference. With many of these problems, the enormity of them is so great that anyone can say as an objective fact, maybe I can't make any positive difference, or the positive difference I can make is very, very small. Whether we're talking about vegan politics, First Nations, what have you. The most fundamental value I have shaping this whole direction, this whole side of my character that links me to both research and humanitarian work and issues as diverse as Cambodia and the Cree and Ojibwe in Canada. The most fundamental value I have under this heading is of wanting to take responsibility, even if I can't. There's no way that I or you or anyone can take responsibility for the history of the British Empire and the terrible decisions they made in how they've handled Canada's Indigenous people, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dene, the Mohawk, the Iroquois. Okay. It's actually impossible for me to take responsibility for that. But I want to. It's impossible for me to take responsibility in any sense for the daily atrocity, the unbelievable moral obscenity of factory farming. I didn't create that system. I was born into this world. I had nothing to do with it. I don't profit from the meatpacking industry. I've never been employed in a meatpacking factory. From a million different angles, we've had this cultural development over hundreds of years that led up to the current stainless steel perfection of the meat and dairy industry, right? There's no way I can take responsibility for it. But I want to. And I want you to as well. I want you to try. Even if you can't do anything about it, I want you to want to try. I want you to share with me in that wanting as a matter of personal values. And I know I'm in a minority. Even amongst vegans, I'm in a minority within a minority. Believe me, amongst white Canadians, in reference to the racial issues, the First Nations issues, the anti-colonial issues, I'm in a minority of a minority. Believe me, I know. And that's why it's so precious for me, it's so worthwhile for me to reach out on the internet and try to meet those couple of other people who share those values with me, even if we share them in a state of despondency, a state of despair, of knowing that our ability to make a positive difference may be tiny, may be infinitesimal compared to the scope of the problem here and now, or even the historical depth of the problem over recent centuries. Now, I think you catch my drift in one sense. Whether we're talking about a neighborhood within your own city, a neighborhood like Compton, or, when I lived in Regina, all the cities in the Canadian prairies have at least one neighborhood, have at least one slum that's majority First Nations people living in poverty. In Regina, Saskatchewan, I knew of one neighborhood like that. There are probably several. And, houses are falling apart. The poverty is obvious. Oh, I remember seeing footage of a neighborhood like that in Manitoba. I think in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and the poverty was you could see it on the front lawns. As the camera just went down the road, you could see the poverty and the hopelessness and the unemployment and the drug addiction. It was visible in just looking at the street, how this neighborhood was falling apart. Whether we're talking about a neighborhood within the city you live in, or we're talking about a faraway place like Cambodia and Laos, from my perspective, it doesn't matter. We're talking about the aspiration to be engaged with these problems, whether it's civil war, poverty, crime, or what have you, as opposed to the impulse, whether it's cowardice or not, trying to ignore them, trying to live a life separated from them and insulated from them. We did have questions from the audience challenging me, asking, well, what if some people just don't care? What if it's none of these issues, that I've mentioned? What if it's not a desire for luxury and laziness or voluntary ignorance? What if it's something else? Aren't there other motives besides this? And I very readily said, yes, there are. And I'll give you examples right now. So this is not me poking holes in my own argument. This is me explaining why such a large percentage of people don't share these values in common with me. I said, yes, just two examples. One, maybe you're a medical doctor who's trying to cure cancer, and you sit down and have this conversation with me, whether it's about poverty and civil war in Southeast Asia or the situation for the Cree and Ojibwe within Canada, and you say, well, that's all well and good, but the only thing you care about is doing this research to find a cure for cancer. And you don't care if you stay in 5-star hotels or 1-star hotels. You don't care if you live a life of luxury or live a life of policy. You don't care if you live a life of luxury or you live a life of poverty. You're just committed to doing whatever it takes so you can do your research, try to find this cure for cancer at all costs. I understand that. And a lot of people live lives of quiet desperation, working hard for causes that are much more humble than finding a cure for cancer, with that mentality, where they regard themselves as an instrument of some grand design or some grand goal that in their minds justifies them living in luxury or living in poverty, them living the way they do with no engagement and no concern for these other social, political issues. I understand that. Again, I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm just examining what my values are, what their values are, and why they're so different. And the only other example I used was of a man who joins the army and who just wants to be the best sniper he can possibly be. Remember, I went through the process. I signed up to join the army, and I met some guys in the army with some attitudes like that. There are guys, and they don't care who they got to shoot in the head. They just want to be the best they can possibly be at that action. That is their art. That is their paintbrush, and that is their canvas, is putting a bullet through a human brain as elegantly and efficiently as possible. And they're willing to sacrifice everything to do it. They don't care if they have to live in a cave. They don't care if they have to live in the desert. They don't care if they live in the jungle or if they're up on the freezing cold Arctic tundra. That's their canvas. That's their paintbrush. That is the art that justifies everything else in their lives. That's what they're focused on. And they may indeed not give a damn about any other social and political problems, whether it's a neighborhood within their own city like Compton or far off Cambodia, and they probably don't even care who it is they got to shoot in the head. By the same token, the doctor working on the cure for cancer probably doesn't care who it is he's performing experimental surgery on or his cancer treatments on. He may be saving the lives of nice people or terrible people. This is his art. This is his paintbrush. This is his canvas. I can understand all of those perspectives, and I can understand the differences in values that separates me from those people. But that's the fascinating thing about this side of politics. When we really get down to it, when we move past the differences in matters of mere fact and opinion, then we get down to this bedrock where all we can say is, this is who I am, and this is who I aspire to be. And we can simply contrast that to whoever you are and whatever dream it is you want to dream. And whether or not we, here and now, in the pursuit of a better world, whether it's under the heading of veganism, ecology, health, politics, whether or not we can dream a little dream together, cooperate, make something positive happen.
À-bas-le-ciel.